Hello, everyone, and thank you for the warm introduction. Before we start, I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians where we are, the Turrbal and the Yagara people, as well as the Palawa people of Lutruwita, where I'm situated down in the northern parts of Tasmania. Now, I was slightly worried I was going to go over time as it was, so feel free to pull me up, depending upon how things go. So today I'm here to talk about refugee adaptation and acculturation. Now, in order to get into things, we'll do a quick little terminology check. So broadly speaking, there's about 85 million people that are currently displaced. What that means is that there is individuals who have been forced to leave their home. Typically, they cross country borders, although not always, and that at that point in time, they're unable to return home. After that, they become, or they can become, what we would call asylum seekers. That's where they're looking to relocate and resettle into a new location for fear of persecution, financial, social, political reasons, or to avoid war. If they are successful in trying to seek asylum, they then become refugees. And refugees is what I'm going to be talking about today. And essentially, refugees are a very unique population when we think about migrants. The reason for that is often when you are a migrant, you're relocating, you're doing so with a purpose. You have a vision, you have an idea, you have aspirations. When we think about refugees, it's a very different set of processes. Often they're leaving where they are quite unprompted. It's an incredibly stressful situation, and often they have a reduction of their agency or autonomy in terms of where they're relocated, where they end up, and the sort of experiences that they have along the way. So it's a very unique population, and one that is requires a lot of investigation in terms of trying to identify the best processes to maximise their outcomes. Now, broadly speaking, what we talk about here is this process of acculturation. It's an intercultural term that essentially refers to the process. Now, note process, that's an important word here because we're talking about changes over time. So it is a process by which individuals learn to adapt within a novel cultural context. It's the ability to pick up certain practices, change beliefs, and so on and so forth. Now, under acculturation, typically the way that it is measured or considered is these ideas of adaptation. Now, two broad types of adaptation are relevant in general, but also for my talk today. The first is psychological adaptation, and typically, are people happy? Have they moved into a new context, and do they have high levels of well-being, low levels of psychopathology, and are they satisfied where they are psychologically? Now, then there's also socio-cultural adaptation. And when you think about government policy implications and all the rest of it, this is typically where the government sort of cares. Are individuals able to navigate their new social setting in a way that allows them to, quote unquote, function? Can they open bank accounts? Can they be financially self-sufficient? Do they find gainful employment? And are they able to converse within society and, again, using John Berry's acculturation classifications, integrate into the host society? Now, I mention here that this is a process, and what I would typically refer to it as a dynamic one at that. And what that means is that over time, there's going to be changes. And I'm going to present to you a sort of very simplified timeline that can happen, knowing, and I will disclose that some of these aspects have been disputed, but nevertheless. So, when we look at the temporal dynamics of refugee adaptation, we need to consider the reason for their displacement, right? They are leaving their home for a particular reason, and typically along the way, they will experience some sort of traumatic event. Corresponding with that, we also have this idea of an uncertain future. They don't know where they're going to go. Typically, as I've mentioned, they have a reduction of autonomy and agency within this. And what that can do is lead to worse well-being and greater levels of distress along the way. This is the controversial aspect of this, but when some individuals then are granted permanent resettlement in a host society, often we can see a positive change in their overall well-being. All of a sudden, they have a sense of safety, they have decreased uncertainty, and they have a sense of hope for the future. But often, migrants of any background, especially refugees, can have tremendous amounts of post-settlement difficulties, right? Australia, despite, politicians standing up and calling us a great multicultural success, which we are to a degree, but there are still pockets of division and discrimination that permeate through our country, and we are by no means unique in that regard. And so individuals who resettle here can have cultural challenges. They need to learn to engage in intercultural dynamics. They can experience discrimination, but there's also psychological challenges. When refugees relocate here, we don't honour their degrees, we don't recognise their status or their skills or their contribution to our society, which is devaluing and dehumanising. And also, all of these things sort of intersect, and employment struggles, affordable housing, all these things are quite difficult. But it's a process. Over time, these things get easier. Skills are developed, acculturation occurs, employment is found, and in the long term, we should see some sort of improvement. And so this is this sort of temporal dynamic process that typically occurs. Now, I'm going to draw out a number of empirical findings from the same data set, which is known as the Building New Life in Australia. So in 2013, Department of Social Services and individuals within the government commissioned a longitudinal project that followed resettled refugees in Australia over a number of times. And to date, there has been 5 waves of data collection, but my understanding is there may be more in the future. And so broadly speaking, what happened was there was about 1,500 migration units, right? That's the lingo, the terms, which refer to essentially kin family groups that have relocated here and been granted permanent resettlement. Within that is the sort of lead applicant on the visa application, which we would call the primary respondent. And they also recruited other individuals above 15 years of age within that migration unit, which we would call the secondary respondent. Now, by and large, it's not that important, except I would point out that the first set of results is just the primary respondents, and that's because they responded to a broader range of measures, whereas the second finding I'm going to present is the entire sample. Now, this was a largely representative sample of resettled refugees. Within that first window of eligibility, 1/3 of all refugees resettled in Australia were recruited as part of this study, which is a massive undertaking, but also goes to show you how little our refugee intake is compared to the need in the world as well, which is something to point out. You can see a variety of different pathways. Interviews were conducted in 19 languages. This was something that I got my hands on during my PhD. It is a high quality data set and project. And so I'm looking forward to sharing some of the things that I've done. So I'm going to present to you the first study that I did. And there were these broad sort of questions that I had related to that, the intersectional, the commonality and the dynamic effect between psychological adaptation and socio-cultural adaptation. And so what I did here was I looked at psychological distress within that first form of adaptation, and I found an indicator of socio-cultural that realistically is of high policy relevance to the government, and that is financial hardship. Ultimately, all governments, but particularly the last one, there is a tremendous emphasis on self-sufficiency, right? And so understanding and unpacking this is a key domain or key area that is of interest. And what I wanted to do is look at the way that those things unfolded over time, but also think about the experiences both in the post-settlement context as well as the pre-settlement context that may lead to better adaptation or worse adaptation as things go on. And the way that I did that was with a variety of different measures. So distress was the Kessler 6-item distress scale. It's very widely used. It's things like felt nervous, felt uneasy. There's also indicators of financial distress, which is, can people pay their bills? Are they going without? Are they missing payments? Do they need financial support? And I looked at a combination of post-settlement difficulties, which was just essentially, tick the box if these things applied to you. And it was employment issues, language issues, experience discrimination, and so on. And I wanted to compare and contrast that with pre-settlement trauma, which was the degree to which individuals experienced a variety of traumatic events before they got here. I did some fancy modelling. It was probably not that fancy anymore, but it felt fancy at the time, which I was going to talk through, but I don't really have much time, so I'm just going to skim over it. But basically what happens is that at any given point in time, individuals will respond to a variety of measures, and the variance in those measures correspond to two key things. The first is those sorts of trait-like variances over time. Are there factors inherent in the individual, their life, their experiences, that contribute to them responding in a similar way across multiple time points? And then, are there variations across time from that? And so, broadly speaking, when you have a hypothetical data set, you have these sort of typical responses. You can see these between person differences in the way that people respond, but you've also then got these temporal dynamics where individuals vary from their own between person differences broadly. And so I did a type of modelling that helped me unpack that. And essentially what it does is it allows you to get rid of those between person differences and focus your attention on those temporal variations that people may exhibit. So this is my model that I ended up running, and I'll talk you through some of the key stuff here. So what we did was we started with observed indicators. Now, I said there's 5 waves. When I did this, there was only 4. So, and I haven't redone it because, yeah, what if it invalidates things? So what we do is we start off with our observed indicators, and then we create latent variables that reflect those between person differences. We then look at the residuals of those observed variables, which is essentially the difference between people's sort of consistent responses over time and their response at a given point in time. And then that then becomes the focal aspect of our model. We model stability, and then we can also model reciprocal effects over time. Here, dashed lines indicate statistical non-significant pathways. Solid lines represent significant pathways. And by and large, you can see that distress predicts financial hardship, especially early within the post-settlement context. And if you recall what I was saying, these sort of post-settlement difficulties that emerge are really going to, if they do emerge, occur early on. That is where the greatest difficulties lie from a theoretical point of view. And then the effect sort of gets weaker over time. When we consider our pre-settlement factors and our post-settlement factors, you can see that post-settlement difficulties predicts both financial hardship and psychological distress, which by and large isn't that surprising. These difficulties include issues related to employment, occupation, things like that. And pre-settlement trauma uniquely predicts psychological distress, but not financial hardship. But some of the key things to bear in mind here is that there is limited evidence of this bidirectional effect at some point in the model. And actually, if I revisited this now with greater understanding of null hypothesis testing and whatnot, it would actually be interesting to see whether or not that significant effect between hardship and distress is statistically larger than the others. That thought literally just came to me. But importantly, there is this stability, right? So individuals who have high levels of financial distress or high levels of psychological distress at one point in time are going to continue to have difficulties over time. There is a stability that is present. And what that means is that the proximal, right, the effect of time one post-settlement difficulties on both hardship and distress will have an enduring effect. It will continue to...
Oh, sorry. Alex, do you have post-settlement difficulties measured at each time point?
No.
Or is this just one big gestalt? Okay.
Yeah, so the question was, is this measured at each time point? And there are a variety of different measures included, but at time one, it was like, what is your big issues right now? And so, pre-settlement trauma was measured then as well. Now, trauma had very little long-term effects after resettlement. But bear in mind that those between-person differences have been accounted for. And so this is only looking at temporal variations once individuals have been permanently resettled. And typically that's actually going to be years after the trauma had occurred. And so that's not to say that trauma isn't important, but in terms of this statistical model and thinking about what it actually measured and what it represents, there's going to be, that sort of effect can be contextualised. I now want to talk about a second study that I published using this data, again using the indicators of psychological distress. And here I thought about, well, that's sort of modelling those temporal variations. But when you think about psychology, the social sciences, it's a sort of truism that there's individual differences and that those individual differences can be meaningfully measured. If that wasn't the case, none of us would have a job. And so what I wanted to do was try to disentangle and unpack the sorts of types of patterns that can emerge when we're thinking about psychological adaptation over time, and once again look at factors in the post-settlement context that can predict this. But I used a different or a range of different indicators of post-settlement difficulties here, so distinct items. Now, this was a very good idea that I was very excited for. And the reason why I know it was a good idea wasn't because I thought of it, but it was because somebody else did. So I wrote this paper in 2020. I was on a teaching intensive position, which is hell, particularly given what happened in 2020. And so while this was sort of simmering on the background, I finally decided and finished the paper, and I thought I was going to submit it. And I thought, I'll do the responsible thing and I'll do one quick check of the literature. And 2 days previously, this paper from a group of researchers in Sydney was published using a similar longitudinal method. But thankfully, they weren't looking at in-group and out-group processes. Same data set, yeah. So I ended up getting, I think, 5 desk rejects for novelty, because of course I mentioned it and I cited it because that's the responsible thing to do. But it's just interesting to point out some of the annoying aspects of working with publicly available data. But anyway, I did get it published. It was published a month ago, which was good. It didn't mean I didn't waste all that time. And essentially, I looked at the same measure of distress, but I included indicators of discrimination, in-group social support, as well as the context of reception. Now, rather than looking at those sort of, within time variations, here I wanted to look at the trends of change over time. So much like at the start of my talk where I had that sort of wavy process, I was really interested in looking at, well, are there certain patterns that emerge? And so it's sort of I did a variety of latent growth curves, which essentially seek to measure, what is the trajectory of change? Does distress increase for some? Does it stay flat? Does it decrease? And so on and so forth. And what that really allowed me to do was think about the way that distress unfolds. Now, there is a narrative, a deficit mindset when it comes to refugees, and broadly speaking, when you compare group of refugees versus other groups, they have higher levels of distress that are more likely to decrease over time. And here you'll actually see, this is the average distress over the sample, and it's approaching clinical levels, so cutoffs of 19 are clinical. The average population is sitting somewhere around 10, and there's this sort of gradual decrease. But there's substantial variation around this. Not everyone's going to follow the same sort of pattern. And so I did a clustering-based technique, and I broadly found 4 different patterns of change evident in this sample across the 5 years. And what that allowed me to do was look at and compare the sort of factors that predicted belonging to one of these things. So this is the group that I called clinically distressed. They were above the clinical cutoff for all 5 years. There was some sort of temporal variation, but by and large, they got worse rather than better. And what I wanted to know is what differentiated them from the recovering group, right? And so when you looked at those pre-settlement factors, the only thing that came out as significant here is in-group social support. Are there members of their religious, ethnic and cultural community that has provided them with a level of support that allowed them to recover? Different comparisons that I was interested in is what is it that separated the clinically distressed group from the group that had reasonably low, comparatively, levels of distress. And again, high in-group social support was important here, but they also were made to feel welcome. So this is a group that had, when we think about those sort of socio-cultural adaptations, they had better adaptation at the time of resettlement, and they had enduring benefits in terms of their psychological distress over time. But there was also this deteriorating group, a group that started off with middle levels of distress and got worse. I don't necessarily think that this is completely shocking, but this group felt less welcome at the time. But importantly, they actually had staggering high levels of discrimination within the post-settlement context. And so what this is really showing us is that, I included a variety of pre-settlement factors, including trauma and all the rest of it as controls. But what this is showing is the provision of support and the provision of social policies that provide support, as well as community acceptance, really has a long-term and large effect on well-being. And so when we think about this sort of temporal process that I suggested at the start, it was mostly sort of supported except for this positive change aspect, which is the most contested, but something that I've never published from the BLNA data, and I absolutely refuse to because I feel like it could be commandeered by bad people, is that the resettled refugees who spent time in offshore detention actually had some of the highest levels of well-being upon resettlement. That doesn't negate the negative experience that occurs during offshore detention, but there is some sort of support for that in the data, but I just refuse to publish it. So what did we learn? Probably not much would be my guess. Social support is good for people, discrimination is bad, but I still think it's important to highlight this. There is around 100 million currently displaced humans, with approximately a quarter of those currently seeking asylum. That equates to filling Suncorp Stadium 2,000 times over. And the reality is that most of these people cannot return home, and they may never be able to return home. And so we as a society need to find better ways, more tolerant ways, and more embracing ways to ensure that individuals are provided with the support that they need within a country that is tolerant and accepting. Thank you.